On April 30th, the San Francisco Public Press hosted a small audience fireside chat where I interviewed Ricardo Sandoval-Palos, the public editor at PBS, who's also one of our board members, about recent attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion and threats to democracy and the media.
DEI became one of those bogeyman words. The White House and the folks who were leading Project 2025 saw that as a way to engage a swath of the American electorate and electrify it.
Among other things, we talked about what might happen if the U.S. government were to cut funding to PBS and NPR, which receive a portion of their budgets from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And then, less than 24 hours later, President Trump signed an executive order attempting to cut all federal funding to PBS and NPR. I'm Lila LaHood. I'm the executive director of the San Francisco Public Press. We're a nonprofit, non-commercial news organization. We do community and investigative reporting and solutions journalism. You can find out more at our website, sfpublicpress.org. We also have a low-power FM radio station. It's KSFP 102.5 FM, broadcasting from Sutro Tower here in San Francisco. And to be clear, because it's an LPFM, low-power FM community station, we receive no funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is going to come up in our discussion today. So lest you think we don't have a horse in that particular race, although we do in some of the other races we may be discussing this evening. Let me introduce our guest of honor. This is Ricardo Sandoval-Palos. Ricardo is, yes, applause. So Ricardo is the public editor for PBS. He's an award-winning investigative reporter and editor who has helped shape a number of nonprofit newsrooms and recently co-founded Palabra, the digital magazine of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Ricardo is a former supervising editor of NPR's Morning Edition, an editor with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the Sacramento Bee, and a Latin America correspondent for the San Jose Mercury News and the Dallas Morning News. He also co-authored the award-winning biography, The Fight in the Fields, Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Movement.
Thank you.
So one thing I want to do, I want to start by setting the stage a little bit. As probably everyone here knows, yesterday marked the first 100 days of Trump's second term in office, a tumultuous stretch by all possible measures. And I would say, for the public press, a lot of the reporting we're doing these days is to try to explain the implications locally and here in California for funding cuts and erratic executive orders, and boy, are we busy. Today also happens to be the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. What else would you like to add for context before we dive into our conversation? I mean, we could say a lot about what's happening with Trump and DOJ, but I don't know, are there any specific things you'd like to bring up before we dive into what we're going to talk about?
I think the one thing that I was thinking about this as I was coming out here today, and it's a numbers game and democracy. Think these numbers: 1st, 4th, 5th, 14th, and 19th, right? These are the amendments that right now are under serious attack. And I was talking to my boss, Paula Kerger, who's the CEO of PBS, the other day, and asking her, in her time at PBS, if she has seen a similar threat to our existence and to the existence of public media in the U.S. It happens every year. There's always a state, there's always a governor out there somewhere, there's always a legislature in an individual state that really, it doesn't want the so-called left-leaning public media in operation. But this is the first time that the threat is actually coming from the White House. Backtrack. There was a similar attempt by Richard Nixon not long after the whole CPB notion, the Corporation for Public Broadcast, started. But you know what defeated that? It was process. It was the democratic process that he was compelled to follow, which defeated that attempt back in the early 70s. And I think that if we remember those numbers of those amendments and think about how those were created, and the process by which any of those can ever be dismantled from our Constitution. That is the process that I hope that we can follow, and many people are now starting to look at a way of pushing back, and it's through the other column of our government, which is the judiciary. And yesterday, the Corporation for Public Broadcast did file a lawsuit to freeze an order that had come from the White House to dismiss 3 of the 5 board members of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So that's now stalled. The judge has called for a full hearing. So let's see where it goes. It's the beginning of what I suspect is going to be a drawn-out process, which hopefully then involves Congress, which hopefully then leads to setting this latest threat aside. So,
thank you. I think that brought in a lot. So, we gave this discussion a title: How do we respond to attacks on public media, DEI, and democracy? And depending on how you define we could be you and me, it could be people in San Francisco, is it PBS, all journalists, the public press, everyone? So you might answer it differently depending on how you're going to define that. So I'll leave it up to you. When I ask you, sitting here today, how do we respond to attacks on public media, DEI, and democracy? What do you want to say? You said a little bit about those numbers, but how would you expand upon that?
well, I think if we fortify ourselves with the democratic process, I think that's the principal way that you're going to see successful pushback, and it is something that's actually mushrooming now. Harvard has done it. A number of institutions have started to look at that as being the most viable answer to a lot of these attacks, a lot of these measures that have come from, in an unprecedented rate and fashion, from the White House. And the funny thing is that the White House makes no bones about what they're attempting to do. When I was in Latin America, I had I would say a privilege, because it was very fascinating, of following Hugo Chavez from Venezuela around for 3 months in one summer. And he had a playbook. And at one point he actually described how they were remaking the Venezuelan government, which was by attacking the National Assembly, attacking the judiciary, not just at the federal level, but at the lower local court level as well. And then finally, an important cog in that was dismantling the media, which was perceived as an enemy of his government. And he did that by attacking, in many cases, their tax status. So one thing that I think that a lot of us need to be prepared for is it's not just going to be public media. Pretty soon, if the White House is successful, you will see attacks on all nonprofits.
That's frightening,
Yeah.
because that's a lot of organizations
Because it's
and
the
entities.
501c3 status, right?
Which the Treasury now can, without any need for reason, just remove.
Yes. The case in point, El Faro, which is a dynamic online, a digital investigative news site in San Salvador. Many of you know it. I think Mary Jo knows it, and others know it as well. It's a hard-hitting investigative shop in Central America. The entire team now is dispersed. The founder is in Brussels. The staff is now living in Guatemala and Costa Rica and Miami. Why? Because the president of El Salvador, Bukele, decided to attack the outlet using threats or an investigation of tax fraud, which is ginned up, but it is enough to chill an operation. So you see that there is this playbook that the current, I would say, regime is following, and it's established, and it's worked in many countries. So I think we just need to be all sort of girded for this kind of an existential struggle. Yeah.
So you mentioned, the White House trying to, or Trump trying to fire board members and how that's been stalled. The 5 directors are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They serve 6-year terms. If the Corporation for Public Broadcasting isn't a federal agency, why are the president and Senate involved at all? And would it be possible to sever ties?
Well, okay, so let me set a landscape. This Corporation for Public Broadcast was created 60 years ago by an act of Congress, hard fought by the likes of Ralph Nader and others who were involved in creating this public media entity. And what it did is established a private corporation that operates with some taxpayer dollars, but then is responsible for distributing this money around the nation to all manner of public media entities. So there is no government involvement per se. The commissioners can be nominated by the president, but the rule also states that the dismissals and the change at the board level are either through Congress or the CPB itself.
Okay.
So that's a division. That's how it was designed in the first place, which is going to make for a very interesting legal discussion pretty soon in the courts. Yeah.
Okay, and I think everyone here probably knows. So you're talking about PBS and NPR, and funding. So funding goes to the national entities, but also to local stations.
Yes.
Can you describe a little bit about what percentage of funding is coming from the government and what percentage is raised in other ways?
So 500 million at least. It goes up to maybe 560 sometimes, depending on the outlay that's approved by Congress. Congress has already signed off, and Trump signed the continuing resolution a couple of months ago that provided funding for public media for the next 2 years, $1.1 billion. So if you divide that over a couple of years, it's about 500 million per year. And it's divided between PBS and NPR, but it also goes to American Public Television, to Public Radio Exchange, and then the bulk of it goes to the hundreds of radio and television public media stations around the nation. For NPR, I think it's NPR itself, the mothership, as we used to say, it's 1% of their budget.
That's not a lot.
It's not a lot.
Okay.
For PBS, it's 14 to 15% of the budget, right? I will note that both entities of late, amid these threats, have, I can't say for NPR specifically, but I do know that at PBS, donations are up, which I think can help make make up some of that shortfall.
So offset.
But here's the threat. The threat is at the local station level. The bulk of rural stations around the country and even some urban stations probably cannot stay open if they don't have the support from the CPB. Some stations, their budgets are up to 60% of their budgets are made up by funds from CPB.
So
for larger stations like KQED, it's a lot less, perhaps, but yeah.
Is there any collective plan to help those kinds of stations through this, or are they having to figure it out each on their own?
Well, let me go back a little bit in history, and then again, as I repeat, this is not the first time this has happened. The best case was Alaska Public Media a few years ago. The incoming governor of Alaska campaigned on a promise to defund public media. He won. And public media in Alaska lost half of its funding, $2 million. So CPB helped, with other donors, helped fill in that gap. And the response was very impressive. They collectively formed a single newsroom for all of Alaska. They brought a lot of the programming into a single house that would then go out to all the stations throughout Alaska. And then very smartly, they reached out to the governor and to the senators from Alaska and said, come in and see how we operate. And let's go out to some of the rural stations that depend on CPB funding. And they discovered that in Alaska, public media is responsible for the public emergency broadcasting, that it's, for many small communities, it's the one entity that can put out news and that can connect them to the outside world. So, and I'm not going to speak for the governor of Alaska, but what I hear internally is that he is now a fan of public media in Alaska. So I think we can count on at least a couple of senators and several congresspeople who might be resistant to any wholesale change.
And isn't that interesting? I mean, the way you describe what happened there, I mean, that was an existential threat, which then it sounds like what they ended up with was a stronger network and one that could serve the whole state more effectively.
Exactly. And I'm not going to say that this is we've been acted perfectly in this entire process. I published a column a couple of weeks ago that in a way took PBS to task for dismissing the DEI unit that we had created at PBS. It was a couple of people, but a couple of very talented people, and it ended a formal framework that they had created. And this was in response to one of the executive decisions from the White House that dictated that any public entity that got public money had to do away with these.
I'm going to have you pause for 1 second. Let's see if that siren will stop.
It's good background music. Yeah.
Never a dull moment.
Exactly.
Okay. So we are going to get into DEI. Yeah. I've got a whole bunch of questions there, but before we head there, it's funny. I was going to ask a version of this question, and then someone in the audience who shall remain nameless gave me a different way to frame this. And this is something you brought up a little earlier. What do you say when people who would describe themselves as conservatives say PBS and NPR have a liberal bias? And when people who describe themselves as liberal say PBS has a neoliberal or conservative bias and that major sponsors have undue corporate influence? And I know you hear it from both sides. Yeah. How do you respond to this?
Well, I hear that every day. And maybe it says something about our audience. In the morning, I get a lot of mail that says you guys are your corporate sellouts. Corporations have undue influence on your programming. It dictates what you put on the air and what you keep off the air. In the afternoon, we might as well be, have just left Karl Marx's summer camp. It's just based on the flow of mail that we get. So we get it from both sides. And in a perverse way, that kind of tells me that, okay, well, maybe we're walking the fence perhaps a little close to the way we should be. My late father-in-law was an Air Force bomber pilot in World War II and in Korea. And he used to tell me that you get the most flak and the most artillery fire when you're close to the target. So, and I always kind of think of that as analogous to how we work as journalists. If we're pissing everybody off, then maybe we're doing it the right way, So,
yeah.
But I'll tell you that the way I answer a lot of that criticism is I said, well, let's examine. Once a week, my assistant and I, we pick 2 or 3 people who have written into us and angry and telling us that we're biased in one direction or another, and we call them and we say, what's the root? What's the source of your upset, right? And we explore that with them. And in most cases, we find out that it's misinformation or something that they heard wrong or saw wrong, incorrectly on the air. And we help them work through it. In many cases, we walk them back from the edge. And I'll tell you a recent example that I'm going to be writing about shortly. Getting a lot of letters of late complaining that PBS archives are no longer linkable to trans programming, to programming about trans people and LGBTQ people in this country, that a lot of the programs that have been produced over the last couple of decades you can't link to. So I said, this is odd. And I'm not sure. So my assistant and I tested the system over the last couple of days, and we've reported back to some of these people who've complained that, no, actually you still can. And we read them, and we gave them the links that work to all of these programs that have been on the air over the last couple of decades. And I'm tracing back the source of this rumor that said that
Where did it come from?
Well, so far as we can see, that there was a couple of online, very conservative influencers who were talking about us, having capitulated to the White House by doing this, which we are showing that it's not the case.
Wow. Okay. So they created misinformation, accusing you something that you hadn't done that would upset others. Okay. So let's get into DEI a little more. Big picture. What is Trump's strategy, or maybe we should say, what is the Project 2025 strategy, what are these attacks about? Why are we seeing all of this right now?
It's a political handle. They seized on those three letters, DEI, because they knew that it had an impact with a lot of people who were upset and were, leveling charges of reverse racism, and that we're all liberal, hoaxsters now who are just out to remake all of our institutions, in particular by eliminating jobs for white people, right? I remember when I was the head of the board for the Fund for Investigative Journalism, we created we mistakenly called it a diversity fellowship at newspapers. We were going to fund a position on an investigative team, but targeted to people from communities that are woefully underrepresented in investigative reporting. And I made it to Breitbart because of that. Breitbart had a headline, "White men need not apply." And so one of the reporters called me, and I said, listen, this is a discussion I would love to have, because then I can tell you about the woeful misrepresentation and underrepresentation of people of color and women in investigative journalism. And moreover, this fellowship was not designed to take anything from anybody. We were growing the pie, simply growing the pie. And so that's the kind of discussion that I think needs to take place. Unfortunately, it didn't take place at PBS well enough. So in my column, I wrote that, there's no reason why we can't continue to do this work. In fact, in many ways, it's legally required because we can't discriminate. The marketplace dictates to us that we follow, we go on this path because any good market-oriented entity will tell you that you have to go where your market is, where your audiences are. And if you're not following the diversity of your audiences, you're going to lose audience. And then you're going to sink into an abyss, which in large part major media has, I think, because in a couple of decades ago, it didn't do that work that was necessary to capture audiences in neighborhoods and in communities that perhaps were unfamiliar with us before.
Okay, so you actually wrote about a question from Pam in Cleveland, who wrote in and said she was reconsidering her support, financial and otherwise, because of PBS's recent decision to eliminate its diversity, equity, and inclusion unit and its activities. And you tried to explain that, PBS executives had consulted lawyers and determined that they needed to heed this mandate, but at the same time, you're saying PBS needs to keep diversity in mind. And so what do you see as the next phase of this work, and how do you continue doing it when at the same time you're being forced to disband a unit that happens to have this label?
Well, for the simple reason that the work was begun and the work was underway before we attached those three letters to it. And I can't stress the importance of those three letters. For some reason, in conservative media, it became one of the buzzwords or buzz phrases that would crystallize support in large sectors of our country, along with affirmative action, right? DEI became one of those bogeyman words and phrases. And so I think very smartly and astutely, the White House and the folks who were leading Project 2025 at the Heritage Foundation saw that as a way to engage a swath of the American electorate and electrify it. And they came out and voted. So I think by continuing the charge is how you sustain support among a sector of the electorate that says, yeah, we can't have this reverse racism stuff going on. But in reality, labor laws and our own society dictate that we have to look like America, right? The marketplace tells us that we have to look like America. So I think the work continues.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think sometimes we have these conversations and perhaps we're jumping ahead and not explaining that, in newsrooms we talk about the importance of having a diverse newsroom to reflect the communities that we're serving. And as journalists, we also talk about the importance of fairness and independence in our reporting, and striving for objectivity and avoiding bias. But there's also been some shift and expansion of what those terms mean. And at the end of the day, it comes down to editorial decisions about whose voices and perspectives get included in the stories we tell. So, as journalists, how do we balance all of these factors to serve our communities effectively?
Right. That's the that's the biggest question, right? Because if we had the answer a long time ago, we wouldn't be in this conundrum. We wouldn't be in the wallowing world of God, are we going to have money for next week in media, right? I remember talking to an editor not long ago, and they had reinvested money. So this is what at the Sacramento Bee, and this was in 2008, and they had just reinvested in a printing press. I'm like, why, right? That's not where your audience is. So we are suffering from a lot of our own self-inflicted wounds in this business. And one of the worst ones has been not making headway into neighborhoods and communities that didn't trust us, that don't trust us, that don't know us. And so now we're having to do this in many places from the beginning and rebuild that trust. A good friend of ours, Sally Lehrman, runs the Trust Project in media. And it's following 8 tenets that can show an audience that you are trustworthy. And one of them is community engagement and outreach, and an honest accounting with the audience, with the public. And it dovetails it with one thing that I've been telling people around this country as I've traveled around over the last year doing these town halls, that a way of looking and spotting misinformation and sources of disinformation in particular is by looking at the About tab online and seeing if the About Us has the names and a way to contact the principal editors, and maybe, if you're lucky enough, a audience representative, but also a corrections policy, how we handle making mistakes, right? If they don't have that, that's a clear signal that that institution, that outlet, perhaps doesn't have objective seeking truth-telling as part of its mandate. And I'll tell you an example. There is Tim Dunn. Remember that name? Hold it. A Texas billionaire based in Midland, Texas, owns 2,000 pink slime news sites around the country, digital news sites that operate on AI-generated stories that have little or no staffs. If they do have a low-paid individual, he or she is simply writing stories in a formulaic fashion. There's 2,000 of these around the country. And if you look at their sites and do that drop down on the About, in many cases there is no About Us. And there's just no way of reaching somebody there or complaining to or asking about that publication. So, yeah.
It's interesting. We've had some of our stories, I think, picked up by these sites, and what they'll do is, I think they'll have the AI change out a certain percentage of the words. So but sometimes they miss words so we'll find out that a public press story has gotten picked up, but it's almost impossible to fight against it. It's insidious.
And then I'll tell you that I'm convinced. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Although it's kind of fun to see some of these theories, right? I'm a believer in the 10% rule. And as an investigative reporter, I used to get calls from everybody, and they would tell me about the grand conspiracy, and I would tell myself, okay, 10% of what they're telling me might be based in some weird reality, right? But it's surrounded by 90% of fluff. But I think that so it's easy to then take that 10% and create a whole reality, which I think we've seen wholesale in the last decade in particular, with the advancement of AI and deep fakes and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay, so just to give everyone landmark where we are in this conversation. I have 4 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience and have some Q&A. So start thinking about your questions. Pay attention to what we're saying, but think about what you want to ask. So Ricardo, we talked about, there's sort of this backlash and, this attack on public media and DEI and will there be a backlash to the backlash? Is that something that is certain to happen? Are you starting to see it already?
Yeah, I think so. I think around the country, hey, listen, when the DEI decision was made at PBS, we got daily at least a dozen complaints coming in the traditional email box that I have. I also maintain a focus group of about 100 really dedicated audience members, and we communicate by subtext, and we have weekly conversations about things that we do at PBS, and it was across the board discussed with what happened at PBS with the DEI unit. And that's why I was compelled to try to explain it a little bit and put it into some broader context. So yeah, the backlash is there, and it will continue, I think. But the scary thing about it is that it has also, that whole movement has engendered more than just, it represents threats to us, not talking about the CPB threats or the threats to our standing as public media, but I mean individual threats. I've had to personally put a filter on my phone, so if anybody tries to call me, and family has tried to call me, and it's intercepted by an AI voice that said, "What are you calling about, and who are you?" Right? Because I've had a number of very unpleasant threats.
I'm sorry, that's...
Yeah. But I figured, hey, listen, I wrote stories about the murders of women in Ciudad Juarez, and afterward was told by a source that the head of the Juarez cartel would prefer that I not return to Juarez. And that threat I took seriously and haven't been back there officially ever since. But so, bring it on, baby.
So what do you think journalists generally could be doing to improve coverage of federal government attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and attacks on transgender people and attacks on immigrants? And I imagine we might be hearing more questions, that get into the specifics. We've been talking, a bit broadly, but what could journalists be doing to improve their coverage of these issues and of these attacks?
I think one thing primarily that you can do now is, as journalists, is go ask questions of what's happening to our data, what's happening to government information, and critical units inside of the Department of Justice, Department of Education, which is by and large going away. They're getting rid of the civil rights units in these large agencies, which was our primary defense against discrimination, our primary defense against abuses. Before these horror stories that we've heard about people being held extrajudicially at the border by by the Customs and Border Protection and by ICE. This has been happening for some time because these agents on the border actually do have court-authorized extraordinary powers, right? To seize phones, to seize electronics, to hold people without charges for a while. So we're seeing this now flower. And so the problem is that now we're losing the recourse that as a democracy we always enjoyed, that always made a difference for us. I see us as being different than many other democracies in that we have recourse. If something happens to us, we know where we can go to complain. We know we can hire a lawyer and perhaps file a lawsuit against ICE for illegally holding us, and that has been a marker of our democracy. That's going away. And so as journalists, I think we need to step up our game and ask questions of the government about what do we do now as a society.
Thank you. I was going to ask, what else do our communities need from journalists at this moment, but I feel like you've actually explained a lot of that. And I have one more question, but I'm going to save that for the end. I'd like to open it up to our audience. What questions do you have?
You can rephrase the question, because for the whole audience to hear either way.
Okay, so the question was that it seems that the right has hijacked some of the language of climate change And what do we do to reclaim that language?
I think it goes in line with the same treatment of DEI and affirmative action and some of these other phrases that were captured and have been essentially discredited, so you can't talk about these kinds of things. And I recall a conversation at NPR when I was there many years ago where I still had editors, and this was like 2013, there were editors of some of the shows who are still asking, well, how do we represent the 3% that doesn't believe in the scientific or the science around climate change? And I said, well, it's 3%, and by and large, every credible scientist will tell you that this is man-made and this is real. So in large part, you have to say, yeah, a couple of people disagree with this, but the preponderance of evidence is clear. And you speak the truth about it. And I think that in some ways we need to get away from labels because they do us an injustice. DEI got in trouble, I think, because a lot of DEI programs were slapped with this label to show audiences that we're doing something in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And I think it was overused. And DEI units were set up that were not properly authorized. By that I mean they got the formula that they had none of the authority, half the information, and no budget to do what they wanted to do or needed to do. So immediately, even in-house, it got a black eye. And that has happened in some cases to the handling of global change, climate change terminology. So I think that we go back to telling a full story about these efforts. We go back to telling and showing the impact that we can show today about climate change. And ask the questions here in San Francisco. What is San Francisco going to do with the sewer outflow system as the sea level rises?
We're looking into it. That was a great question. Yeah. So the question was, if you look at other places that have pulled themselves back from autocracy, what was the playbook? I think specifically referring to the public media playbook or sort of other things that helped that recovery.
Well, I think it's basically we do our jobs. El Faro, the example that I cited, still publishes. And it still has very good sourcing inside of El Salvador. It recently showed that the Salvadoran miracle that the MS-13 has been defeated and so forth actually came at a cost. And that cost was the government negotiating with MS-13 to stop the violence and we'll let some of your leaders out of prison, right? And there's exchange of money in some cases. So Alfaro continues to do this, right? They just can't be in the country because then they'll face tax fraud charges. So that's been one response. The other response is to continue to do your work wherever you can, however you can, but do it in a fashion that then shows audiences the reality of the impact of cuts, for example, the reality of what this playbook, the consequences of this playbook, and how they're affecting communities. That's another strong way of doing it. I do think that one way that I know that at PBS, what we've done and what a lot of people in the system have tried to do is show the impact of the local station on individual communities, particularly in rural states. And many of those are red states. And interestingly enough, those stations are the ones that are most immediately on the bubble. So you show the impact to your local representatives, you show the impact to your local leaders. A great example is Midland, Texas, in the same place where the Texas billionaire lives. West Texas Public Media does this wonderful thing. They don't have a budget to have a newscast, but they organize and have done for a number of years now a public debate at an old theater. And people come and they respect the Robert's rules, and it's this wonderful public discussion about different issues. And it's wildly popular. It's won a lot of fans in a very conservative community. So I think those are the kinds of models that many communities, I think, are now looking to and saying, we have to do this work. Yeah.
So the question is PBS willing to forego its federal funding?
Well, I can't speak for PBS in this regard, but I would say that from my position looking inward, I don't see how we can, for the very reason that if we say thanks but no thanks, it gives those who would like to permanently do away with that source of funding, saying, hey, y'all are okay without us. So let's take that $500 million a year, which is nothing compared to a lot of budget items in the bloated federal government, and say you don't need it. But the consequences of that would be that many stations, individual stations, which are autonomous in the system, PBS, except for those 3 hours from 7 to 10, really can't tell individual stations what to program. The rest of the clock is in the hands of the local programmers. And so that same autonomy might come at a cost if that flow is interrupted. So, yeah. Although I will say and reiterate that donations from high net worth individuals and foundations have gone up in the last few months in response to the specter of losing this funding.
Okay, more questions. So the question is, and the person who asked this question was talking about listening to a program on KQED that described DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as also affecting people with severe disabilities, and that perhaps there are a lot of people out there who don't realize that DEI is about inclusion in defined very broadly, and what can be done perhaps to reframe what we're talking about so that people actually understand what this means and what it encompasses.
I think quite simply the way you do it is go back to what the original mandate was for public media, is that you have to represent your community. You have, listen, PBS, I defended the airing of a biography of Clarence Thomas because we were being attacked for, why are you presenting this documentary that was a glowing account of his life and his rise, right? And my answer was, well, it's the same institution that's bringing you, that brought you a frontline look at Clarence Thomas, which is really markedly different from the view that we got from this particular documentary. But the idea is that public media is a big tent. It has to represent as many sides of particular issues, the many dimensions of events around us that reflect our communities writ large, nationally or even locally, right? I can't imagine any public affairs or media organization being able to survive over the next 10 years if they do not re-examine their communities and their audiences and say, we need to look and sound like our community. And we haven't done a good job in the past. That's what necessitated this move to DEI. It was an attempt to bring everything into a rubric. But I think that work, I understand, and I have confidence in the people who are doing it. They're really good, sharp individuals who tell me that that work continues. And it has to, because it's a marketplace. Yeah.
How does this work get done without the people who are trying to do it getting in trouble for doing it?
You know, I don't think I can't imagine, and at that point is where you would draw something in the line in the sand, a line in the sand, and say, you know, we're not going to backtrack from this program. And I think, for example, this is where things like this rumor about PBS doing away with trans programming or the links to it comes in, and how those rumors get started. You just have to continue to probe and question the local public media entities. I'm looking at your archive, and I don't see much programming on disability rights or individuals, how they cope in your community. What are you doing about that?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
ask those questions as audiences. Yeah.
That was a great question. So do you have a sense or a demographic profile of the people who call in or write in and deliver their concerns to you?
Well, purposely in our letters, we don't ask for a race or gender. and or age. But by what they talk about and the subjects that they bring up, you can kind of get an idea of where they are. Unfortunately, the public media audience still skews largely white and older, right? This is why we're always, I always joke that, my God, we have to reach out to these people because these are our audiences, right? And it is a demographic that does skew older. And I think, like media, like most media in the U.S., continues to be dominated internally by white men. The statistics still show us that at least 60% of most newsrooms in the United States are dominated by, or comprised of mostly white men. So, but I feel compelled not to ask those questions directly. It comes up in conversations. So I get the sense that we're still skewing older, we're still skewing white. But I do get questions after George Floyd, and I do get questions about DEI that showed me an impressive response by communities that are directly affected by our decisions in that regard. Yeah.
So what is PBS doing now to get better statistics on its current audience and its potential audience, the people it would like to try to reach that are not currently part of its audience?
Sure. I think that even before the DEI unit was officially created, there were annual surveys of audiences, of content, of staffing. So all of that was going on before DEI. And I've not heard anybody say internally that they're going to discontinue those annual surveys. And I think you have to do that. I mean, any wise, even commercial outlet, it will tell you that we have to follow our audience, where our audience is. So I see that we're continuing.
Thank you. I see your
I hope anyway.
Thank you. I see your question here in front. Okay, I'm going to restate in the microphone. We're seeing some high-profile journalists at 60 Minutes, at the Washington Post, leaving their positions in protest, but it's not seeming to generate any change at those institutions, at least not yet. Can you talk a little bit about this? And, thinking about there's a loss here, and is it having the effect? What results might we see in the wake of these departures?
Well, I would hope that we as a media are learning lessons that you can push back, that you can fight back, that you can stand up and say, oh, well, okay. I mean, it's not going to affect how we do our work internally. Specifically at CBS and some of the other networks, they were being sued in some cases by Trump himself for defamation. And those entities, they'll say in the case of CBS, actually had ongoing petitions with the FCC for mergers or acquisitions or other business things that I think they decided that they didn't want to rock that boat and perhaps lose a valuable license. And so they made those decisions to acquiesce to the demands. So it's out there. A lot of other entities are probably seeing the writing on the walls and saying, maybe we should follow suit. But the scary thing about that is that then you start self-censoring. Then you start saying, well, let's not go there. Let's not do a story about trans people, right? Or a trans community. I haven't seen that yet at PBS. I continue to ask because of that same reason, right? And talking to colleagues, even at the Post and other places, even at the Wall Street Journal, there is pretty aggressive reportage about the injustices that are happening at border checkpoints, the injustices of people being removed from this country illegally and without due process. That reporting continues at a really strong pace, and I think as a media, we're holding up fairly well. We have a lot of flaws in this whole process, but I do continue to see some strong reporting about critical issues. Right. So, I don't know.
Any other questions from the audience? So the question is, how would you get rid of advertisers on public media? And our person asking the question has said, could you cut them in half? Could you get rid of them entirely? Do you really need this funding source? What can we do about it? The ads are annoying.
I would agree, but I don't see them going away. However, the cool thing of what happens at PBS is it has a very strong standards and practices division. And right now, the standards and practices at PBS are being rewritten. And that is the question. How strong have we been in the past policing the content of these sponsorships?
Right, they're not actually ads. Okay, our questioner says they are ads.
I will tell you one thing that really bugs the heck out of me, and you see these all the time on public broadcasting, is those half-hour infomercials. For me, is a source of consternation. Those, and I've written a column about this that shows how many of these are actually done and they're given to stations for free because many stations need content, especially around pledge time. So they get these half-hour TED Talk-like conversations, but from a doctor who says he's got something that's going to fix your brain problem, right? Well, go online and look at the lawsuits that have been filed against a lot of these people. You know, you'll see that for the longest time, the PBS archives and the YouTube site for PBS still had 8 documentaries done by one of the leading anti-vaccine misinformation spreaders. And after we wrote about it, those were pulled because, you know, that exists, and that is a problem in the system that I know that a number of executives are concerned about it. But again, the local stations have this autonomy, and they're being given a lot of this programming for free. So,
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that. I find that surprising. I mean, I personally know a dozen documentary filmmakers in San Francisco who, maybe for visibility, would be happy to give additional content. Why, during pledge time, are they looking for free content?
Again, because they have a clock to fill. And they might not have the resources to pay a documentary filmmaker for a locally produced documentary, right?
Right. Well, people do want to be paid for it.
I'll tell you that PBS doesn't directly own the majority of its programming. PBS is actually a platform onto which global and national creatives can present their best programs. What PBS then does is distribute them. A lot of the programming is actually produced and funded by the local stations and consortiums of stations throughout the system. Rick Steves could not get his local PBS affiliate in Washington to carry his show when he first started. So he went around the country trying to find a PBS affiliate that would carry his travel show. Finally found a good reception with Oregon Public Broadcasting. And today, Rick Steves is a net generator of income for the entire system. So
that's amazing. Lisa's telling me we need to wrap up, but I want to see if there's one last question out there. We have one question over here. So the question is, how do we convince people to pay for good journalism? Because the money is needed to keep it going.
Well, the most direct way to do it for this audience, and tell you, if each of you, does anybody know Amway here? Let's follow the Amway model. So 5 of you, I will contact directly and say, give the San Francisco Public Press $5.
Thank you.
And each of you then will be asked to go out and get 5 people to do the same, right? And all the money that goes up that pyramid goes to the public press. That's one way of doing it. It's a quick way of doing it. I actually have an idea, and there's no time here to talk about this idea, and I've actually tried to put it out there with a couple of people in the industry that might be able to make a difference here. I think there's an entity in our marketplace that's overlooked when we talk about funding for local media. And this is the internet service providers. The ISPs that have 300 million homes wired for the internet. And they survive on the content that is generally given to them for free, by and large, by local media outlets. And I have suggested to people in the business, why don't we ask the public very quietly and gently for $1 a month on your internet bill that goes to internet content services. Now you start multiplying the numbers, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that can go to local outlets, and regionally, local governing boards could help distribute the funds to nonprofits and other news outlets in a community. This can be done. There's a model for it now. Cable companies that support public access stations follow a similar formula. So I've suggested, why not take this to the ISPs? You won't need government to be involved with this. This could be something that the industry can solve it on its own.
Ricardo, I like that idea, and what a great way to wrap up. Thank you all. First, Ricardo, thank you for being here this evening. This special episode of Civic is a project of the San Francisco Public Press. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org.